C.S. Lewis was one of the most influential intellectuals of the 20th century. He's best known for his Chronicles of Narnia series, the Screwtape Letters, and Mere Christianity. Lewis weaved together Christian theology, Platonic and medieval philosophy, and cultural insights to speak not only to the cultural moment of his day in a world that was embroiled in the Second World War and its immediate aftermath, but he also presciently spoke to the challenges we are facing now in the 21st century in some pretty amazing ways.
Can you imagine how awesome it will be to have American astronauts plant the flag on another planet for the first time? Bam! Bam!
Now, in my humble opinion, the most important series from C.S. Lewis that I think is speaking to our current cultural moment is one of his lesser known works. I didn't even know these particular books existed until I got to college. And some friend of mine who knew I was kind of like into science fiction was like, you know, C.S. Lewis has a science fiction series. It's called like the Space Trilogy. And I was like, oh man, tell me more. So today we're going to be talking all about C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy. And to do that, my guest today is Annie Crawford. Annie Crawford writes and speaks on the works of C.S. Lewis. I love her insights into C.S. Lewis. She is much more of an expert on Lewis than I am, so I'm really excited to have Annie here today. Annie, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Paul. It's great to meet you, and I'm looking forward to talking with you about my favorite topic.
Awesome. Good. All right. Well, maybe we can start with, for those listeners and viewers who have never read C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, you know, the hardcore C.S. Lewis fans are going to call it the Ransom Trilogy. If they've never read those books before, they are really like three very different books, aren't they? Could you maybe start by giving an overview? Each of them, you know, all together they get called the Space Trilogy, the Ransom Trilogy, but they have their own separate titles. Could you give a short overview of these books and maybe talk a little bit about how they're different from book to book?
Yeah, my pleasure. So the series started with a little bet between Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. So they were friends at Oxford, famously, and they would get together and discuss their favorite literature and discuss one another's writing. And they both complained that no one was writing the kind of books they liked. No one was writing the books they wanted to read. And so they would have to write them themselves. And so they both agreed to write some kind of fantasy style, sci-fi fantasy style of book, which is what they were really into. And Tolkien said he would write a time travel book, and Lewis said he would write a space travel book. Well, as we all know, it took Tolkien forever to write anything. And so Tolkien never quite got around to his end of the bargain, but Lewis was actually a pretty quick writer, and he started on Out of the Silent Planet, this space travel story. And so he very much, what they were interested in is the work of, let's see, H.G. Wells and the kind of OG science fiction writers who are exploring in this age of industrialization. You have this fascination with, well, how far can our technology take us? Can it take us beyond the walls of the world? And so you got H.G. Wells and some of these authors exploring that. And this fascinated Lewis because he felt like so the modern age was one of, rational enlightenment. And we talk about it as a disenchanted age where the modern believes in stuff he can taste and touch and feel and measure. And Lewis and Tolkien saw this as dangerous to live in a reductionist, materialist world, and that our kind of religious impulses had been sublimated. And what Lewis noticed is that those religious impulses were leaking out in the realm of science fiction. But in the realm of science fiction, there was this edge of openness for modern man to a sense of wonder, to the world of the unknown. And so what Lewis saw the potentiality of sci-fi is to open up the modern person again to the possibility of the other, of something outside ourselves. And so that's really what the Out of the Silent Planet is about. Is he has this character, Elwyn Ransom, who is a philologist. Okay, so this is a nod to Tolkien. It's kind of a character based off Tolkien. And he, in Out of the Silent Planet, is kidnapped and he's taken into outer space to Mars. And very much the story is following the story beats of, H.G. Wells' book about travel to the moon. And so he's kind of imitating that style, but to a different purpose, to re-enchant the modern imagination by taking us to a place where we're open to the mythic. And then instead of, going out and meeting aliens per se, Lewis takes his character out into outer space and they meet angels and characters from scripture, but characters reimagined within the imagination of modern space travel. So that's Out of the Silent Planet. And really the main purpose of that book is this baptizing of the imagination. So for C.S. Lewis himself, it was the work of George MacDonald and George MacDonald's stories about fairies that opened up C.S. Lewis's heart to something beyond the material world. And he wanted to do that for modern 20th century people. And so when Ransom, at the beginning of the book, when he's kidnapped, he's taken into space, he expects, as a good modern rational materialist, to go into space and to find it empty, to find it cold, to find it terrible, in the way that Blaise Pascal talked about the horror of the emptiness of vast space. This is what a materialist modern imagination expects you to find. But then when Ransom gets out into outer space, he actually encounters life and light and a plenitude and an abundance and a glory. And so Lewis wants to open this trilogy by opening us up to the possibility of the mythic, of the spiritual, using, the symbols and tropes of sci-fi, which modern people had already come to love. So that's Out of the Silent Planet. Perelandra, the second book. So this was a success. Okay, let's go to book 2. In Perelandra, he goes to Venus. So in the first book, he goes to Mars. And what's interesting is, I don't know that Lewis planned this, but he had his imagination was so saturated with medieval cosmology, with medieval symbolism, that he almost seems to fall into these symbolic structures that he discovers and then develops. So he starts by exploring Mars. Well, this is a very masculine activity. This is something I wanted to talk to you, Paul, if we start talking about Elon Musk today and his connections to some characters in the space trilogy. Well, space travel is symbolically a very masculine thing to do. I want to keep it family friendly and not maybe unpack the symbolism too explicitly, but these rockets are going into space to and to seed our identity in the womb of worlds. There's a very masculine activity to space travel.
I think even Austin Powers hit that in one of the movies where they were sending a rocket into space.
It's not that hidden, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So his first book, he ends up exploring, Mars, the masculine planet, and what masculinity is. And so then when he goes to write the second book, he moves to, well, let's go to Venus. Let's explore what femininity is. And Venus, that story, Ransom ends up, by way of adventure, being called to Venus and encountering a world framed by the symbolism of the feminine. And so that second book is an exploration of feminine symbolism, of what it means for us to walk in submission to Christ. And that book really has a more mythic flavor. He imagines Venus as a return to Eden. Again, gardens, that's a very feminine symbolism. And so in this story, Ransom returns to Eden, this feminine planet, and it's an exploration of the fall, kind of a retelling of the fall, so that we might learn by looking at what went wrong in the fall, a disobedience, a lack of submission. Lewis imagines what would it be like to relearn feminine submission and to see it not as something icky, like in our modern imagination. Again, this is part of baptizing the modern imagination. we see power structures as oppressive and negative and evil, and then therefore any kind of submission or obedience is oppressive. And yet the truth is, within a Christian cosmos, hierarchy exists. God is God and we are not. He is the creator and we are our creatures. And so in a Christian cosmos, if you serve a good order and a good king and a beautiful king, then actually submissive participation in the rule of a glorious king is actually a glorious, beautiful thing. And so Lewis in Perelandra is firing on all imaginative cylinders to do everything he can to help us try to reimagine femininity and submission to Christ as something beautiful, tempting, glorious that we would want to participate in. So those are the first two books. Let me pause there, see if you have any
let's unpack
you
some
want
of
to say.
those because that hideous strength almost feels those two are in my reading of them they're more akin because you have space travel going on. That hideous strength is entirely terrestrial in some sense, aside from the influences in the terrestrial world. I think, it's just interesting. If you've never read these before, your mention of H.G. Wells is the first thing that came to mind when I first got into reading Out of the Silent Planet. I think what I had a grid for when someone said, hey, C.S. Lewis and it's science fiction, was I was kind of importing my earliest exposures to science fiction as a kid, thinking this is what I'm going to get into. So it's going to be maybe like I'm looking for Star Wars or Star Trek, something like that. And then when I got into it, I realized, oh, geez. Well, first of all, this is written and released in 1938. I mean, it's before the space age even hits. We don't even have the space wars, the space race, I should say, between the United States and Soviet. This is like World War II is brewing. So this is, I mean, going in with an expectation. I think some people, when they read Out of the Silent Planet and even the description of Ransom, heading into space in his spacecraft, the descriptions of it don't feel very scientific to us. And then if you get him to Malacandra, to Mars, and the description of Mars, if you're expecting this like modern scientific description of what Mars we know is like, you're going to be disappointed. But when you step back and you think of this like a play on H.G. Wells, that makes so much more sense. But I went from that, and I did do these, my first reading of them, I went consecutive from Out of the Silent Planet right into Perelandra. And Perelandra felt like, okay, Out of the Silent Planet feels like H.G. Wells. Perelandra felt like, I've never done psychedelics before, Annie. I've had a lot of guests on before who have had former psychonaut experiences and maybe have come out of those and found the Christian story and Christian tradition to be more satisfying. It felt like reading a psychedelic trip. I mean, even one thing, like right from the get-go, is, in Out of the Silent Planet, Ransom is traveling to Mars in what we would call like a spaceship. In Perelandra, he gets to Perelandra. I use the British because that's the audiobook reading I have in my head. Americans might say Perelandra. He gets there in a coffin, right? I mean, there's like this totally different feeling. It goes from H.G. Wells sci-fi to much more fantasy. Let's even just unpack that for a moment. What do you think C.S. Lewis, the clear connection to H.G. Wells in the first book is there? What kind of influences do you pick up on when you read Perelandra and you think of like, man, this is instantly really foreign and weird. You're getting into a coffin to get to Venus. This is not the same kind of story that the first book was. What is your read on that?
Yeah, I love hearing your experience of those two books. So my read on that is, if we pay attention to the gender symbolism, this will unlock so much of what he is doing. So Lewis was a medievalist and a great book scholar. He was saturated in the pre-modern imagination. I mean, he could read Homer in Greek. He read Dante in Italian. He he was his imagination was saturated with that medieval cosmology. And, that was, even in Out of the Silent Planet, again, one of his primary aims was, let me use the modern, masculine, technological, sci-fi tropes that the modern imagination likes, but to take you into space and surprise you with an encounter, a kind of reimagined or renewed encounter with the medieval cosmos. And then when he shifts to Perelandra, he wants to explore that medieval cosmos more. He wants to pull you in, further up and further in to this re-enchanted way of perceiving the world. And so he's going to take us to, as I already said, this feminine planet. Let me see if I can pull these together. So for Lewis, before he was a Christian, he writes about how he felt very bifurcated. He felt torn in two between the rational self, the analytical self. He was trained by a professor he calls the Great Knock, who was an atheist, logical positivist, who was rigorously trained Lewis in like modern rationalism. And so as a young adult, he was thoroughly shaped by this modern rationalism, and he was an atheist. But as a boy, he had loved nature, and he had loved the mysteries of the Irish hills he grew up in, and he loved fairy tales, and he loved stories. And so he says that everything I really loved and cared about, the imagination and all these stories, and that stirred up desire in my heart, I believed to be false. And everything I believed to be true was cold and sterile. And he wrote a poem about it a poem called Reason. It's a fantastic poem if anyone wants to go look up. And he said, I feel torn in two between cold, demanding reason and warm, fertile imagination. Who will reconcile in me these two parts of myself? And I don't know if your listeners are familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist lately. Ian McGilchrist talks about the bifurcation of the modern consciousness between those very things, the analytical and the imaginative. And so Lewis's whole life story is about this desire to reconcile these two halves of himself. And famously, he found that reconciliation in Christ through conversations with J.R.R. Tolkien and a few other friends, realizing that it is in in Christ and the incarnation of Christ, fact and myth come together. And he has a whole essay called The Myth Became Fact. And so it was the Christian incarnation that brought Lewis's world together. And so I think he's doing something similar with Out of the Silent Planet. We're going to travel to the masculine planet, and it's going to be in the language of sort of scientific rationalism that rediscovers a sacred world. And then he's going to take us to the feminine, because he would very much associate the masculine, with the maybe more analytical side, and then the feminine with the more mythic and imaginative side. And so I think he's taking us to those two different realms. And then when we get to that that hideous strength, when we get to that hideous strength, the first word of the book is matrimony. That hideous strength is all about how we bring the worlds together, how we marry again heaven and earth, fact and myth, reason and imagination. And so that very much, I think, is the structure. And so Perelandra feels so different because he's moving us out of the masculine, analytical, sci-fi mode into an exploration of the feminine, the mythic mode. And then he's aiming toward, in the third book, showing us a way to bring them together for the healing of our own world.
That's beautiful. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, and then I've got so many follow-up questions to that, Annie, but I don't want to leave people on the edge of their seat on your excellent breakdown here of each of these books. So then how does that come together in that hideous strength? Maybe you could give us an overview of the book and then weave together how you see this matrimony of the masculine and feminine. And then we need to dig into that a little bit, because for Lewis, I think those are categories that, especially in our maybe more postmodern, post-colonial world that we live in, with the feminist critique and plenty of talk about gender ideology, that I think it's it's a foreign concept to us to think of it in the same way that Lewis thought of it. But let's start with maybe, how did you see those come together in that hideous strength? How is that hideous strength? To me, that hideous strength, I was so surprised by when I first read it, because it felt so tonally different. I could see some continuation there between Out of the Silent Planet and Perelandra. Didn't know what to expect when I got to that hideous strength. And that hideous strength felt like such a completely different book. Describe how that maybe is even just in his tone, his approach, even if you were to give it some sort of subgenre, it's like, is this science fiction? It is, but it has this like political intrigue. It's a very, very fascinating book.
Yeah. So Out of the Silent Planet, you have the mode. It's the masculine exploratory. It feels like an adventure story. Perelandra, very mythic. Those influences are going to be like Paradise Lost and some of the medieval poems. And then you get to that hideous strength, and it really opens very much feeling like a realist modern novel, and immerses you actually kind of in the world of bureaucracy. The second chapter is a really riveting college board meeting, and so
Right.
which makes a little bit more sense if you remember the screw tape letters. And so much of what Lewis was wanting to do is I think the thread that moves throughout all of his work is this desire to recover the sacred imagination, I use the word, the sacramental understanding of the universe. He thought that the loss of a sacred understanding of the universe, or an incarnational understanding of the universe, was leading to the abolition of man. And so Lewis experienced, it's a matter of utmost urgency that we recover an incarnational view of the world, which will give us an incarnational view of who we are as humans, which will keep us from destroying ourselves, right? So throughout all of his work, trying to recover this pre-modern sacramental understanding of who we are, but he's trying to recover it, not just a repetition of what's come before, but what he called a transposition, which is kind of like translation. Someone's writing in French, I'm going to translate it in English. And in transposition, he's trying to translate through using the metaphors or the images of the modern world, right? Because you could just go back and read Dante, let's say, but the metaphors or the imagery that Dante's using isn't familiar to us and doesn't make sense to us. So Lewis is like, how could I take what Dante's saying or what Plato is saying, but translate it into the images, the metaphors, the experiences of a 20th century person? Okay, so in the screw tape letters, he's like, I want to try and explain to people, help them understanding a sense of the demonic. What modern metaphor could I use to communicate a sense of the demonic? And he's like, I have a great idea. Bureaucracy. Like, if I were to communicate what hell is like to a modern person, it would be a Kafkaesque experience of being trapped within bureaucracy. Right. So
As
for Lewis,
a true professor would
yes.
feel like that, or he's suffocated by administrative world.
Right, exactly. These layers of paperwork.
Yeah.
That for him, he thought that bureaucracy was a great metaphor for communicating some amount of evil to us. So I think that's why in that hideous strength, he's going to take us to the modern world and how evil is being instantiated or incarnated in our world. And for Lewis, that was very much through this techno-bureaucratic building of a Neo Tower of Babel that Lewis saw us as. And Paul Kingsnorth, if your listeners are familiar with him, he uses the word the machine, that the modern world is trying to build up this powerful, complicated techno-industrial structure of power that will finally allow us to be autonomous, independent, triumphant over nature. And Lewis, in the beginning of that hideous strength, on the title page, he alerts us to what he's doing, because he gives a quote from a 16th century poem, 15th century maybe, about the Tower of Babel. So he gives us this, that's where he gets the title, that hideous strength. It's a phrase that this old poem uses to describe the Tower of Babel. So he's saying this is a story about the Tower of Babel. And so when it kicks off, the style is going to feel very different because he's trying to give us a modernist, realist novel about how evil is manifesting itself in our actual world. So it is, the trilogy as a whole is a wild ride because each book is so different. And yet if you can start to see the symbolism, the symbolic structure of what he's doing, it will really start to come together for you. So let me pause there before I go into maybe gender and that hideous strength and see if you have
that's
any
great.
other questions.
So we've got Ransom, who's the protagonist in the first two books, and he does appear in that hideous strength as well. But it is, in some sense, we've lost the primary antagonist from the first two books, right? We've had this character named Weston, who in Out of the Silent Planet maybe represents maybe the unhealthy masculine, right? So he descends upon Mars on Malacandra, and there's some real clear indications that he's coming to subdue the planet in a way that has no care for the native inhabitants and the creatures of that place. It may be something akin to what, like the Avatar movies are maybe trying to tap into, not Avatar, The Last Airbender, but the aliens with the blue skin Avatar, that maybe there's something like that he's, might be a comparable modern comparison where this Weston character has no care for the creatures of that planet. It's simply a project of his own ego. And then we see him reappear in Perelandra. And in Perelandra, he transforms into more than just a man. He becomes what Lewis calls the unman. And there's this climactic struggle between Ransom and the unman. And then, of course, he's not present, technically, right? He's not present in that hideous strength. And we see kind of a new group of antagonists. It's not just bureaucracy as a concept, but we have kind of this shadowy conspiratorial group there. What connections maybe do you see between this kind of exploration of maybe the unhealthy masculine, the masculine that's driven by ego, monument to self, the propensity to objectify, right? That would be the unhealthy masculine, to take your power, to take your ability to produce, and to turn everything external to you as to an object that celebrates your own ego. Maybe that's the Babel comparison as well. And then his transformation into the unman. Would you unpack a little bit of Weston as the unman and then the antagonists in that hideous strength, and maybe help me and the audience see where there might be overlapping threads? Because in some ways it's like I was kind of wanting to be like, oh, will Weston or the unman come back somehow in the third book? And he's not there, but you still see the unman's presence in a different way in the third book. So who is Weston and the unman, and then who becomes the antagonist in the third book?
Yeah, that's great. Okay. So I think you're spot on with Weston as an image of the unholy masculine, the vicious masculine, the demonic masculine. And I think if we go to Genesis for just a minute, it might help us see that more clearly. And then we'll be able to see the way the pattern plays out in that hideous strength. So in Genesis, you see the world born through the marriage of heaven and earth. And N.T. Wright and other New Testament scholars will talk about how what you see in the structure of the Genesis narrative, which isn't so much a scientific material description of the beginning of the world, but a description of the meaningful structure of the world. And you have God, the creator, making creation his world. And so immediately what you have in the structure of the cosmos is this creative binary, heaven and earth, light and dark, morning and evening, sky and sea, sun and moon, form and matter. And so that the cosmos is structured by a creative binary. And it is the union of heaven and earth, the union of form and matter that bears new life and then fills the world with God's creatures. And then, mankind is the apex of creation. And so he's really placed here at the vortex, or the center, the fulcrum of the world, bringing up matter and earth and creation and animality, and meeting spirit and God and meaning. And we, in that way, are a microcosm of the whole. And that's part of why we are in the image of God, male and female. So even as humanity relate to one another, the masculine, you being joined with the feminine, that is how this creative binary is how the world is born. And that's the way that God structures his creation. And Lewis, in the Four Loves, he says, so he calls this union of the masculine and the feminine the pagan sacrament, or the way in which all of us, Christian or not, image forth really the story of the world, which is that union of heaven and earth. And he says that this is why, that marriage and our sexuality images the mystical union between God and man, creature and creator, Christ and his bride. And so this is why this masculinity and femininity is so essential to understanding everything that Lewis is doing, because the proper relationship between male and female is the microcosm, the ground zero for a proper understanding of the whole cosmic structure. Okay, so back to Weston and the toxic masculine. So what the masculine is to do is God, the masculine creator, gives the world a good order, a beautiful order. And we see that order in Genesis. Again, the structure of Genesis is, if you look into it, the structure of a temple. That Eden is at the top of a mountain, and that's a temple structure. And so God gives the world this good order. And in our masculine role as stewards or exercising husbandry over the earth, our job is to perceive the meaning and the purpose and the nature of things, and to cultivate its potentialities. So this is part of Adam naming the animals. He doesn't just impose a name. He doesn't impose a meaning. Good husbandry, good masculinity will perceive the meaning in the thing, the nature, the purpose in the thing, and then will shepherd it and steward it and empower it and lead it into greater flourishing. That's a proper masculinity. The false masculinity, as you're saying, it objectifies in the sense of it refuses to perceive the inherent meaning or purpose of a thing. It reduces the thing to a mere meaningless matter that I can exploit or play with or manipulate in any way I want for my own, purposes, which are always going to be about power, right? So when you erase the meaning and the purpose of things, and you objectify them and you reduce them to molecules and matter, then the only meaning left is will. This is where Nietzsche's right? The only meaning left is will. And so that's where you see Weston. And the first toxic masculinity of Weston is a very materialist Weston. He is going to ignore the purposes and the natures and the beauties of Malacandra and the universe out there. He's going to ignore those and objectify those in order to exploit them for material resources, so that he can perpetuate just the material survival of the human species, right? And so it's the toxic masculine understood through the materialist framework. And you very much do. This is what freaks me out about Elon Musk and the Mars travel, is we have to just get more resources to perpetuate our material existence. But to what end? To what end? We're right. To what purpose? And is that actually our purpose, right? Is it our purpose to perpetuate our physical existence as far as possible? Is that what we're for? Then when we go to Perelandra, it's very interesting what Lewis is doing here philosophically. Hopefully I can make it sense. So that's the materialist side. And what you see in modernism, postmodernism, is that there's always a flip side, because the world is not just material. It is spiritual. There is a spiritual realm. But by ignoring the material, we separate off the material and the spiritual. And then so there's always this disconnected flip side. So the Weston in Perelandra is an idealist now. He's not going to Venus to try and perpetuate the material existence of humanity. He's kind of become a pantheist, a Hegelian pantheist. So now Weston is all about spirit, pure spirit. And his endeavor is to perpetuate the existence of this kind of pantheist spirit. And so what he's trying to do in Perelandra is basically harvest the spirit of the creatures there. He's not concerned about material existence anymore. It doesn't matter. It's about consciousness colonizing a kind of consciousness, a certain kind. And this for me, so I have actually in my college wild years had a era of exploring psychedelics. And I think, I actually have an article coming out at Salvo this spring about that story that people can look for. The Salvo magazine is a fantastic magazine. And the part of Perelandra that for me most resonates with that psychedelic experience is that psychedelics always seem to push people towards pantheism. That through this drug, I'm tapping into a kind of world consciousness that realize, that I am just a part of this world consciousness, and the enlightenment is going to be about fusing my own consciousness to the world consciousness, which is really a kind of spiritual devouring. That our own individual consciousness will yield it up to the cosmic consciousness. And Lewis saw that as the essence of the demonic agenda, to harvest your soul from you, so as to perpetuate its own spiritual principality. And that's so for Lewis, the materialism is a guise, a mask that is actually masking a hidden spiritual harvesting that's actually the real game. And that's how, when you get to that hideous strength, you'll see maybe that structure there, that on the outside, the NICE, which is the organization that ostensibly is gaining governmental power in order to perpetuate the health and prosperity of the human people. And so on the outside, it's going to get rid of disease. We're going to do scientific experiments, maybe, on viruses in Wuhan, perhaps, in order to, ensure the health of humans. We're going to do these experiments in order to perpetuate material prosperity. But actually, on the inside, what you reveal as the story goes along, as you peel off the layers of the bureaucratic onion, at the heart of it is this demonic principality that wants to harvest your soul. So does that make sense? You have any questions about that?
Oh man, no, I'm loving this. You are just nailing this, Annie. This is yeah. So that's we see this very, very clear shift in Weston. I want to sit with Weston's character a little bit more, because as you properly identified, he's just, an old-fashioned materialist in the first book. And then we get to the second book, and then Ransom's even taken aback when he starts having conversations with Weston. He feels like, oh, Weston's had some change in view and change in perspective. And he even confesses, I don't see the world like I used to, old friend. I have been re-enchanted. And there is something here I want to sit with for a moment, because there's a lot of good work being done on, whether it's people engaging with the work of Charles Taylor in the secular age, which is Lewis is identifying this stuff long before Taylor even wrote that book, but it's a very, very similar concept. You have in the materialist framework, you have only the value for immanence, only the value for material, what is right in front of us. And as you say, like Weston's problem is he's going there to perpetuate the material, but without any structure for meaning as to why that is going on. And in that way, it feels akin to, and again, I want to be family friendly here, but it feels akin to a man who cannot control his urges of testosterone. And he has never even thought about what love with a woman is intended to produce, and is simply following that instinct to produce. And so he goes from that to, we might say he almost goes post-secular in the second book. He's kind of shifting out of the secular age into this re-enchanted world. And one of my concerns, and one of the reasons why I've been doing so many conversations with people who have had psychedelic journeys and experiences, is because that does seem to be one of the gateways for people who have lived in this secular age and have lived within the materialist frame. It predictably and reliably induces in people a sudden awareness of powers that transcend them. And here's my concern, and I've voiced this many a time before, and I'm thankful for this side of my Pentecostal and charismatic upbringing, that I didn't live within a worldview, even as a child, that assumed all engagement with powers that may transcend me as a finite mortal being are automatically for my good. I have seen things that people wouldn't believe, that have lived in the material story, or maybe even just lived, in a pretty strong cessationist Christian tradition. I have seen things that seem very akin to what you would see in the Gospels. And so I've never lived under the delusion that all transcendence, that all powers that transcend us are automatically for good. And so one of the things I've been deeply concerned about is this movement from the materialist to the Weston of Perelandra, who becomes the unman, who opens himself up to a power that transcends him, not realizing that they're in the cosmology that not only Christians have affirmed, but I think there's something to the fact that you can go across times and culture, pre-modern world, and many, if not most of the cultures and civilizations have some sort of category for powers that are not benevolent. There's a malevolent realm of powers. And so Weston opens himself up to the spiritual, but it is not a spiritual that's oriented towards the good. It's actually a moving away from the good still. And that opening up turns him into, it possesses him. It transforms him from a human into this truly, as C.S. Lewis is intending to communicate, this incarnation of evil, like a demonic manifestation that Ransom has to wrestle with. And this is an important point, Annie, that can we pick at here for a moment, because let's bring it even into practical terms. And I will not make it a habit. I don't demonize anybody in the political world, but the parallels to Elon Musk in the aspirations of Musk to go to Mars, to colonize, to make humanity an interplanetary species, at times sounds like, has he read this book and these books and is intentionally stealing Weston's talking points? I would so love, again, I am not demonizing Musk in this regard, and I'm hopeful that he would, maybe someone in his life would get him the space trilogy, he would read it, and maybe be able to differentiate between that purely objectifying masculine and maybe a truly good masculine aspirational sense of, like, we do want to contribute to the flourishing of the cosmos and bring it into its right order. And God has given us tools and the gift of general revelation so that we could bring health and well-being to people. And that creative ingenuity, I don't want to demonize, but I have my concerns about the parallels there. And again, I'm not demonizing Musk at this point, but I would hope that those parallels, they are eerie to me in many regards. The talking points feel very, very eerie. What would be if you could sit down with Elon Musk and you had an hour or 2 hour block where you could just sit down face to face, you handed him the books in advance so he had time to read them. What would you say to Elon Musk to help steer him away from the direction of Weston becoming the unman, and maybe in a direction of that sort of aspirational creative ingenuity, maybe being set into its right ordering in God's intention for the cosmos?
My goodness, what a great question. And yeah, hey, I'm here in Austin, Elon. So I know you've been hanging out here available to chat. and read these
Yeah,
books
do
with
it,
you.
Elon.
Yeah, because he's such an interesting character because he clearly, as you say, he's obviously echoing these points. And I think the best explanation for that is that there is clearly a power, a principality of transhumanism that's been brewing for a long time. I mean, this was actually a major part of the Nazi project. If you take a deep dive into pre-World War II scientism and even America, World War II really freaked us out about where our questionable love affair with technological capacities might lead us, right? And I think the Nazi experiments freaked us out, sobered us up, and backed us off the transhumanist spirit that was really brewing coming out of the turn of the century that Lewis saw. I think this is why Lewis often feels prophetic, is that the use of technology to attain utopia and overcome death was a spirit very operative at the beginning of the century. I mean, the whole eugenics movement. But the Nazis, when they grabbed control and then started acting out this ideology in ways that shocked the world, I think we backed off. And now I think we're forgetting. I think we're forgetting in some degree the lessons of that era and then starting to starting to live out that story again. And so I see Elon as, a very smart, as someone who's he's got a boyish, wholesome enthusiasm for making
Yes.
things, for
Mhm.
adventure. And so, what I always want to do is start by affirming the good that is there. And I do think that, we live in a culture where masculinity has been somewhat demonized. And so I always want to begin with men are awesome, and the masculine spirit of adventure and the masculine desire to make things and to explore new territory. Those are God-given wonderful gifts that I am really thankful for. It's about bringing that masculine spirit into proper alignment with our purpose as humans made in the image of God and made to serve God, right? So I would start by just affirming that. I think that's wonderful. And I think that, that's part of masculine or Musk's sense of adventure. That, I'm thankful that he bought Twitter. I don't want to be too political, but I do think free speech is important and that we've experienced some censorship. And so I appreciate his courage, his willingness to take a lot of criticism for what he felt like was right. And that was also something you saw in Weston, actually, in Out of the Silent Planet, the kind of angel that rules over Melicandra says, Weston, you're not totally bent because you're willing to sacrifice yourself for what you think is truly good. And so then the question is, could we pause and slow down and think about what the good is? Let's think about our value hierarchy. What is the true good of man? Is it just to perpetuate material existence? What is our true good, and to have a real conversation about that. I think the problem with just trying to perpetuate our material existence indefinitely is that life has to serve a higher purpose. There has to be a reason to live. And the danger in trying to overcome death by resisting it is that death has actually been given to us as a mercy after the fall, right? So that we have fallen away from God, and there's been a kind of twisting of our nature and a separation. And if God then didn't remove us from the tree of life, we would be trapped in this state forever. And so death is a kind of merciful limit put on the consequences of the fall. And then Christ comes and he enters into that world and he transforms death into a portal to a new and renewed world. Excuse me. And so, I need to think about better how to talk through all of this, but I feel like it's about having clear conversations about what our value hierarchy is. what is our highest good, and how do we attain that highest good? And perpetuation of a material existence just doesn't satisfy the human soul. It's not adequate to create to create a life worth living in.
Mhm. So that would seem akin to the lesson of Babel, right? Is that the desire for to ascend, the aspirational desire to even just imaginal, using spatial language, the desire to go up, to look up, is a desire for. We'll borrow language from the Eastern tradition. Is there's an innate desire for theosis in us to
Yes.
experience union with God, not the sort of kind of like pantheist union where there's a dissolution of yourself,
Yes.
where you lose yourself in it all, but a holy recognition of your unique capacity as an image bearer, not dissolved and absorbed into some to
Yeah.
personless ultimate reality, but to a loving, intentional, personal ultimate reality. That longing for union, it is, it's what the late Baptist theologian Stanley Grenz argued was like one of the defining features of the human species. And we look around at the other species on our planet, and for the most part, it seems like, we don't have chimpanzees who maybe bear a lot of likeness to us as a human species. We don't have them traversing the high seas to go explore undiscovered country. They're relatively satisfied in their habitat. And unlike that, we don't have a niche. We don't long to just sit, for the most part, in our habitat, our niche. There is this human propensity, this longing for the infinite. There's this sense of
Yes.
infinite obligation. And that, for Grentz and others like C.S. Lewis, is only satisfied in the journey of spiritual transformation, of union with God. And so counterfeit expressions of that, whether that's the symbolic Tower of Babel, where we're trying to build up, or technological achievements that would conquer death, as if death was, it's like we still miss the Genesis 2-3 story, like entirely, where it's like, they walked out of Eden and they didn't die. They weren't physically dead. That wasn't the curse. The curse was this dissolution of relationship. It's the thing that Athanasius talks about on the incarnation, where the trajectory of our destination was jettisoned away from the good. This falling away movement, and you can see this in Origen and Gregory of Nyssa and Augustine, is this idea, borrowing some Neoplatonic language that Lewis would be very comfortable with. So you have this good that we have derived our being from, and the falling away is it's a descent away from that good. And so we long to kind of like build and climb back up that. But this strange thing you mentioned, Hegel as maybe a potential influence on Weston. We have come under this sense, and Lewis keenly identified this idea that, that the longing to be built back up and ascend towards the good gets perverted as this notion of perpetual progress. That perpetual progress is what we are ultimately oriented for, as if progress was only defined by how far we could move away from the past, how far we can build up technological advancement that differentiates us from those, superstitious people in our past, or these ideas of wisdom that we've had in our past. We just simply move away. And that seems like archetypally might be embodied in the, NICE group of that hideous strength, is this idea of progress is simply moving us away from anything in relation to the past. Do you think that's a fair read of Lewis and what he's trying to get at in these critiques of Weston and the critiques of NICE, NICE?
Yeah, Paul, I think that's really, really well said on several levels. I think your idea of, and yes, thank you for fleshing that out in terms of rethinking about our value hierarchy. This created world, maybe we think of the adventure of climbing a mountain. I was into mountaineering in college. which is a similar sense of adventure and exploration and attainment as, going to Mars. Mars is just a bigger mountain, right? And so these are good. We're made to explore, but they aren't the ultimate good. They're meant to be signs toward a spiritual reality where we will find our ultimate satisfaction, right? So my desire to ascend the mountain or to go to Mars is a tutor for me, a sign, a physical sign or a tutor to teach me about my longing for God, to climb, the spiritual mountain, the cosmic mountain, to attain theosis, to mountains are always an image or a symbol of heaven meeting earth, right?
Yes.
And so I think that's exactly it, is that, Musk and this desire to go to Mars. And I've had some discussions with people on Twitter of, yeah, I know that we need something to aim at, but our ultimate aim needs to be theosis, needs to be God. And that's the essence of idolatry, right? Is to take a created thing and rather than see it as a sign or a pointer to God, to see it as the thing itself. That's the essence of idolatry. And so I think, Paul, your description of that is right on. And what progress does is distort that natural human desire to move further up and further in, which when rightly ordered would be to move through our experience of the created thing to the fullness of its spiritual reality, which is Plato's cave, right? Moving from the shadows of the things to the things themselves. That's a proper understanding and movement of our desire to go further up and further in. And then what modern progressivism does is take that desire to kind of move further up and move further, but obfuscates it, because what you realize is at the end of progress, there's no telos. So in God's created world, there are clear purposes. It's a teleological world. Birds have wings so that they can fly. And our human purpose is theosis. There's an end point, a clear end point that we are moving toward. In vague progress, it takes that desire to go further up and further in. And there's no clear end point. Like you say, it's just a moving away from, which perverts us, because then we're going to move away from ancient wisdom toward we don't know what. But as long as we feel like we've just, got a bigger machine or a bigger rocket or, another microchip in our head, it feels like it's a pseudo theosis, right? It's a movement of a false hierarchy. That's really, I think that's exactly what Lewis is talking about in all of this.
Okay, so you see this in, I think thinking about Musk's motivations and our desire to be interplanetary. I just so appreciate your identification of what maybe good motivation would look like for continued space exploration. There may be some appropriate path for something like that. It might not be inherently wrong to desire to explore space, but maybe if we sit and realize the proper ordering and what our ultimate fulfillment is going to be found in, maybe we get to the point where like, hey, maybe we don't want to. I don't know. I don't know on that front. I'm suspicious of it, as you're saying, it becoming an ends, it becomes an idol. And idols historically, and C.S. Lewis was very, very tuned into this in the Space Trilogy. Just as one of the things that, I don't think I could have read it when I was younger and maybe locked into a different, maybe stricter framework where, anyways, I won't get into that, but I really appreciate he's exploring in these books, especially in Perelandra, you see this like exploration of, so what were the pagan gods, right? I say this because in a sense, Mars, like symbolically and literally, whatever literally means, can become an idol. Mars is literally an idol for many people right now. There's another idol that seems to be unfolding, and it's an idol when it says, I am the end of all of your desires, right? I've seen recently Sam Altman, the whatever his title is at OpenAI, the tech innovator and probably one of the more influential persons in the space of AI, recently announced a desire for a new project that they're calling Project Stargate. And again, I'm trying to work on this discipline in my own life. I realize I was deeply formed by postmodern cynicism in culture, and I am very much not trying to be a cynical person in a new phase of life. Cynicism is a prison, but I also am not going to fall into some sort of just naivete. And when I hear a project of this sort of ambition and I see the name Stargate, I can't help but think of what Lewis is describing. And he talks about explicitly throughout these books that, maybe kind of these longings for aliens, for what has become, coined non-human intelligence, for that there might be some overlap between what the ancients, what we modern, enlightened, scientific people might see as aliens, non-human intelligences. And Lewis starts flirting with this idea that maybe those are modern placeholders for what ancients would have described as gods, principalities, and powers. So this project Stargate, and a Stargate is what? It's like a portal to other dimensions. It's symbolically a portal to connecting with alien life. I can't help but think about the psilocybin-induced trip that maybe somebody had that came up with this idea of, well, I've connected to some entity on DMT or something, and I need some sort of doorway. There is some power or consciousness beyond me, and I very much want to open that door because it made me feel enlightened, and I have all of this wisdom now about the world. And Lewis, I think, has something to say about that. And I think he calls it, at various times, he calls it macrobes in that hideous strength in Perelandra. He even names specific, what we might consider like archangels, and gives them what he says was their pagan names in times past. Obviously, Mars and Venus have deep connections to pagan mythology. What would C.S. Lewis have to say about Project Stargate?
I told you so. Is probably what he would say. Yeah. So, yeah, there's so much to be said about this, and it's so fascinating right now. In scripture and in the ancient world, again, so Lewis is looking back at the ancient world, saturated in the wisdom of the pre-modern world, and endeavoring to communicate that wisdom to us in modern metaphors we can understand. So if we look at that ancient understanding, we look at scripture, I think there's a lot of interest right now in Genesis 6 through 11, right? Because this weird little passage of scripture that a lot of it is kind of like, yeah, and moving on, is seeming to become important. And, God seems to really enjoy chiastic structures. That as a chiastic structure is a reverse parallelism. So you go A, B, C, C, B, A. And so that as it was in the beginning, so it is at the end. And I can't help but see these connections between, and I think Lewis as well, again, he told us this was a story about Babel. These connections between Genesis 6 through 11 and the neo-Babel that is emerging right now. And so what you have in Genesis 6 is that, Adam and Eve are created, and they rebel, and they fall, and they're cast out of the mountain of God, out of Eden, and they're encountering the consequences of the fall, death and disease and the frustration of tilling the earth. And so to deal with the problems of the fall, we're going to turn to our creative abilities, our ability to create technologies that will help us mitigate and overcome the effects of the fall. Now, this is not in and of itself bad. We are made in the image of a creator God, and we are given the role of co-creation. So that is a good response. The problem is, as fallen creatures, we will grasp. This is that whole objectification. If I'm going to be a co-creator, a good co-creator, a holy co-creator, a virtuous co-creator, I'm going to pay attention to the inherent nature and purposes of things and honor those purposes in the way that I cultivate creation. Okay, a fallen one will ignore those purposes again, objectify and manipulate as desired to attain greater levels of power. And so, what you have in the tradition with Genesis 6 and then the book of Enoch, which is becoming an interesting popular talking point right now because it helps us understand. The book of Jude in scripture cites the book of Enoch, and that the book of Enoch really opens for us the way that Second Temple Judaism understood the scriptures and these stories. So in Genesis 6, what you have is that humans tempted to wed themselves, to participate in demonic principalities, fallen angel principalities, for the sake of gaining technological power or knowledge. And you can just see, no matter how you interpret this, whether you're like, okay, the angels literally, the symbolic meaning is there, because think about it. Anytime that we act immorally for the sake of gaining technological power, we are doing this. We are joining ourselves to a fallen principality, a rebellious spirit. We're joining ourselves to a rebellious spirit in order to grasp after technological power that we can use. So that's the structure of how this works, right? And then Babel is this image of that brought to a great and high, powerful point to where, God says we have to scatter them. So I see the flood. So you have in Genesis 6, humans joining themselves to demonic principalities, and the result is evil and monstrosity. This is where the Nephilim come from. And this tradition, so the Nephilim is as the sons of God look at the daughters of men, and that the fallen angels look at the daughters of men. What are daughters? What is the feminine? It's body, potentiality for incarnation, right? So that's how I interpret it, is that the fallen principalities, these fallen angels, look at the daughters of men as their an embodiment they want to steal in order to incarnate their own purposes and their own spirit, right? And when that happens, the result is these Nephilim, these demigods, these part angel, part human, these corrupted creatures, right? So a hybrid is a corrupted creature because you've taken the purposes of two different things and you've mixed them in a way that damages God's original purpose for the angels and for the humanity, for the humans, right? So Lewis is picking up on all of this. Both Lewis and Tolkien had this secret fascination with it. In that Hideous Strength, the leader of the NIC, the Tower of Babel, let's say, he speaks, Lewis says, in an antediluvian tone. So Lewis says he speaks in the tone of this old antediluvian, pre-flood Nephilim world. Traditionally, these Nephilim, these demigods, these monsters that are the result of this unholy alliance between fallen principalities and humans, they're seen as giants. They're seen as giants. And so there's this whole tradition and legend of giants. Well, Merlin is a giant of a man. Right. So Lewis is very much doing these allusions to say we are reenacting the story of the antediluvian story, the participating in demonic principalities for the sake of technological power. We are building up Babel. We are setting ourselves up for the flood. And the element that's interesting that Lewis adds, and this will hopefully bring all this together to connect to Stargate for you, is that in modern materialism, we convinced ourselves that the world was largely material. Even the Christians in cessationalism convinced themselves that we're largely operating on a material plane, and this whole world of angelic principalities and demons and was really kind of put in the closet. Okay, not something that we experience as real, not something we're paying attention to. And so then in the modern materialist, rational, sensationalist age, we lost the stories and the the way of knowing how to discern and deal with transhuman intelligence and transhuman principalities, we lost that knowledge. And then here we are, all of a sudden, re-engaging with these higher levels of intelligence, which are going to be symbolically associated with the stars, because that's just the structure of the world. Here we are standing between heaven and earth. I'm standing on the earth and I'm looking up into the heavens, and I look up into the heavens and I see these stars, and these stars that move in these perfect patterns. And so for humans, the stars are always associated with a kind of intelligent, rational pattern above me, higher than me, yet having influence over me. This is why stars are always symbolically connected to an angel or a principality. In that rationalist age, we lost traditional knowledge of how to cope with those principalities and discern them. We lost that knowledge, and now all of a sudden they're flooding back in, and we are largely vulnerable. As you say, I worry also about this reenchantment. I mean, it's good in the sense that it might open people's hearts to God and Christ and a kind of spirituality, but I think it's probably more dangerous, or as dangerous as it is good, because people don't have robust cultural structures of spiritual discernment. And
Not
so
in the
they are
West.
easily confused and easily opened up to all these portals. You know, I think of that Marvel scene, at the end of, is it Endgame?
Endgame. Yeah.
Yeah. And all of a sudden these portals open and these powerful beings come through, and we don't know how to discern who's who and how to relate to them. And Lewis's book, I think that Hideous Strength is a really good place to start thinking about what that might look like.
Yeah.
Which
And
we
he
could talk about if
even
you want, or we might be out of time.
no, how are you doing on time?
I'm great. Yeah, I'm good.
Great. Let's keep going here, because this is so good. This is so important to dig through. And I think Lewis is the part that I wouldn't have been ready to take in maybe 15 years ago. I see Lewis doing, and there's books like Planet Narnia that what's the author's name of that? Is it Michael Ward?
Michael Ward.
See the yeah, kind of outlines the way in which maybe Lewis sought to give a proper ordering. Is there a place for a proper ordering of what the pagans were searching for in their pagan idolatry? And so even in Perelandra, he gives Mars and Venus. He explicitly names those deities that would have been recognized by the Greeks and the Romans, and says there is an ordering for this, right? Like there is an ordering for in which we maybe symbolically should have reverence for. If you can think of maybe the pagan deities as largely representative of they're symbolic of features of the natural order, what we might call today as the natural order, the things that are beyond our sphere of control. We might name them as the kind of the realm of non-order, the things that seem to be beyond our capabilities of ordering. We always give them, modern people, we would maybe just go and be like, well, there's Godzilla, or there's a Marvel hero, right? That represents these ideas. But the Greeks would have Athena, and then they would have Mars, and the Romans would have Jupiter. And so Lewis seems to say, kind of like the modernist thing would be like, no, just put those all back in the closet, stuff them away, because they don't really exist. And I don't want to get into the ontology of this. I'm much more interested in the phenomenology of this. Maybe I'm a little bit of an existentialist in this regard, but you can get hung up on the ontology and the metaphysics of, are these what real means. But Lewis seems to say, no, there was something there that we don't just throw out and say it didn't exist. Like, did Zeus exist? Did Odin exist? Did Thor exist? And I think Lewis's answer is like, almost from what I've seen Jonathan Pajot say. It was like, yeah, of course they existed. Like they held a position of power, like phenomenologically, over people. And
Yep.
so obviously they exist. Obviously they are principalities and powers that did play some actual role. And so what he seems to be saying is like, maybe there is kind of like a proper ordering for recognition of those and recognition for how they've actually gone astray, how they've led people astray into becoming idols. And he seems to say, no, there's a place where we could say, these are real, and whatever real means. But we should recognize, you brought up Merlin, for those that haven't read through all three books, Merlin appears in That Hideous Strength as a symbol, right, of white magic. And maybe they think what we might be getting at is that we've been blind to the reality of magic. And now that we've become more open to magic, we just see magic in all one category. But there is something the medievals had, those backward medievals, in the Dark Ages, that they understood categorical differences between white magic and dark magic. And so maybe there are agents of white magic, like a Merlin, that are operating in keeping with God's right ordering. And there are agents of dark magic. And he gives an interesting name that I'd like to explore just a little bit here, that in That Hideous Strength, the term employed is macrobes. And I love that term because it captures what we might be when people are talking about things like hyper objects. They're trying to find a way of recognizing the phenomena without totally throwing out the things we have learned from science and materialism. And so he uses this term macrobes as in like, we couldn't see microbes at one point, but now we recognize they exist. There's this other category. So what is your reading of what a macrobe is, our new openness to magic, and whatever concerns you may have with a project like a Project Stargate? If you were to sit down, now you get to move on from Elon Musk, Annie, and you get to sit down with Sam Altman and you go, hey, dude, this is the thing you better be aware of if you're not aware of already.
Yeah. And I think, Paul, that's really well explained in terms of Lewis's view of the gods and the way they embody truths about the world that are very much real, and that shape the way that we live in the world, regardless of how you want to define the ontology. The fact that we still tell stories about Thor, and those stories fascinate us, and those stories then shape the way that we maybe think about ourselves and our world. The stories do. And this one thing I've heard you talk about in some of your podcasts that I've enjoyed. We inhabit a story. The stories that we tell shape the way we understand who we are, where we're going, and how we ought to act. And so in that way, Thor is very real. We're still inhabiting stories about Thor that are still shaping, that still have agency on us, right? And so I do think we're all being challenged to rethink what we understand is real. I've long thought that Christians don't have any idea what they mean when they say spiritual. Like, what are you talking about? I don't think that right? And so similarly, like magic. So magic functions in stories as a kind of narrative symbol of spiritual realities, right? So there is this connection between magic and spiritual and agencies and causalities that are not purely mechanical, not purely physics or chemicals in motion. Yes. So in that sense, just to realize the fact that I am right now thinking, that I have a consciousness, that my mind is able to make rational connections that are not reducible to neurological chemical activities. The fact that I can will to raise my hand or lower it, that's magic, right? That's magic. So Lewis, he talks about this in his book, Miracles. The mind interjecting causality in the world is itself our experience of the spiritual realm and of magic. And part of why the scientific world doesn't see it is scientific analysis always works in what's already happened, right? So if I look in retrospect over what's already happened, I can trace a line of physical causes. Okay.
Yeah.
And then the spiritual or the mental agency disappears because I could trace the medium through which it worked.
Yeah, you're just
Okay.
focusing on the material cause while denying formal cause, final cause, all of those categories
Exactly.
from Aristotle.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. And so for us to recover, that's what spiritual world is. This world of formal and final causes and mental agency. And all of that is part of the spiritual world. And it is as real to us as our every breath. And so Lewis talks about we've prioritized this outside material analysis and convinced ourselves that's the only real one, in denial of our very daily common sense, immediate inside experience of agency. And he says, on pain of idiocy, for the love of God, we have to recognize that our internal mode of knowledge, our internal experience of life from the inside out is as real and is as important for understanding the world as the external. So that's, in terms of the macro. So that's just, first, let's just recognize the reality of mental agencies, narrative causalities. Those are real things, and we experience it all the time. And so then I think you're right in terms of hyper objects, or Lewis's idea of macrobes, ways to name levels of agency, mental causality, a narrative agency, symbolic agency that function at a higher level than the individual. Now, what's interesting about his name Macrobe, though, is so Lewis in Screw Tape Letters, he says he has Screw Tape, this demon, right, who is writing his nephew on strategies for, devouring the humans. Strategies to capture and devour the humans as their demonic spiritual food. And Screwtape tells his nephews, we have great hopes right now. He's kind of giving us the demonic strategy that in due time, we're going to learn how to mythologize science to such an extent that what is in effect a belief in us or the demons will creep in while the human mind remains closed to belief in the enemy or God.
Oh, wow.
The life force. So he says the idea of a life force or, scientific ideas of forces, because you know what? We don't know what those are. We don't know what gravity is. We don't know what the strong force is. So even science reaches this endpoint of its own mode of understanding and runs into mystery and transcendence, even at the level of, the quantum, which we're all trying to reckon with, right? So this idea that if we can mythologize forces, if we can mythologize the ecstasy of sex, so sex, why sex is always at the center of our ethics is, as I've said about, it's an image of the gospel, it's an image of the purpose of creation. But it's pleasure also, the ecstasy of sexual pleasure is one of those places like hallucinogens that we get pushed out of our materialism and into an encounter with the mysterious, right? So life forces, the worship of sex, all these things might prove useful so we can produce our perfect work. So for Lewis, this is the aim of all this, a materialist magician. The man not using, but veritably worshiping what he calls it, these forces, while denying the existence of old religious spirits. The end war will be in sight, right? So if he can keep us with enough scientism and materialism in order to make us poo-poo old religious categories and language, but then mythologize the edge of our science enough to open us up to direct participation in demonic principalities, like that's the goal, to make us not, in our snobbery, reject old religious categories, but in our mythologizing of science to create a kind of new scientistic religion that will lead us to openness again. And I think that's what Stargate is,
Hmm.
that we've mythologized artificial intelligence and aliens, and those are categories of where our normal materialistic understanding hits a boundary, a portal, and we open ourselves to it, and we desire participation in it without actually understanding what it really is. But because it feels scientific, we're boldly open while still being closed, right, to liturgy and Eucharist and older modes of mythic participation.
Whoa. Oh my goodness, Annie. You've just blown my mind here. That is an incredible connection. Okay, so thinking about, I know we probably got to put a bow on this here shortly, and we're gonna have to have a second round of conversation about this. There's 10,000 more things and avenues I want to explore here, but that idea of techne, the connection between techne, magic, and the Christian, not denial of its existence or reality, but the historic Christian practice of forbidding techne, forbidding practices of magic where we are simply we're trying to figure out the formula that gets us to our ends, right? And so this is deeply tied symbolically, whether we can see it or not, is deeply tied to is pagan ritual, right?
Yeah.
It's what do I need to sacrifice, to give up in order to achieve and reach the ends of my desire? And so I recognize there's powers beyond me. So I have to come up with the right formulaic of words, the right number of sacrifices, the kinds of sacrifices, and that is the means by which I come about and bring into reality this end. And this stuff is so deep, and we just miss that it's still here with us, all the time. I mean, even something as simple as, you could go to ancient Babylon, the ceremony of the grasping of the hand of Marduk, right? When a new king was being inaugurated, and he had to grasp the hand of Marduk, and there was this symbol of he is now the indwelling manifestation of the power of Marduk here. And there's this techne to that. But we have these sorts of ceremonies all around us still. I mean, in some ways, I'm not saying that we should throw out, presidents being sworn in with a hand on the Bible, but I would have kind of maybe a almost Anabaptist kind of concern about, are we really just trying to use that as a form of techne, power, where we're saying, I am tapping into what I believe is a power here to achieve these ends, or am I actually consecrating myself and saying, this is a symbol of me swearing to the highest good that I am going to be in service to you, God? I think, at various times, you could point to instances and say, well, maybe that's happened, but maybe more times than not, we are still even trying to use at times the language of Christian mythology, the language of Christian sacrament as a form of techne. I think Paul Kingsnorth has, even though he's a relatively recent convert to the Christian story and Christian community, I think there's some wisdom that he has had about concerns on, are we using Christendom as a form of techne to uphold an idea of particular civilization? And there's just really good conversations that are happening around this, but you've just nailed it. Oh my goodness, Andy. I'm gonna re-listen to that particular segment probably 30 times to unpack it all. What do you have to go ahead?
Okay, on what Paul Kingsnorth is talking about, I am very sympathetic to his concern. If we think about hierarchy, the world will always lay itself out in a hierarchy. That there will be that highest thing we desire. That's just inevitable. And so it is a concern if we put civilization at the top and then we use Christ for civilization, right? That will bring about problems. And you can see examples of that in the Middle Ages, right? Where political power used the church. And that does bring about a problem. So you want Christ himself and
Right.
theosis to be at the top of that hierarchy. But, you know, political order, all the rest of reality has its place in that hierarchy. We need leaders to organize us, to, make sure we have shelter and food.
Right.
The structure is there. So it's not that government
Definitely.
is
No.
bad, it's that it needs to have its right place in the hierarchy, right? So sympathetic to that concern. The problem is, and this is at the heart of all of these frustrating conversations about Christian nationalism. You have to have story and ritual that bind you. It's
Absolutely.
inevitable. You can't,
Yes.
we're just embodied narrative creatures. There's
Yeah.
no way to live our lives without some kind of story and ritual emerging. And so, like you're saying, we have to have some kind of ritual that embodies the transfer of power. And that ritual that embodies the transfer of power should bind our leaders and our loyalty to our leaders to a higher good, higher than just the leader himself, lest he be a tyrant. And we don't know what that is as a people. Like, we don't have a shared hierarchy. We don't have a shared good. And that's why culture is so fraught right now, right? Because there very much is a danger of using Christ for political purposes. And yet our political purposes have to be bound through story, through ritual to something higher than themselves. If they're not to be tyrants, what is it? And
Exactly.
and we've tried to this is where we've tried to have in the Enlightenment era bound to sort of abstracted Enlightenment principles. But postmodernism has destroyed our ability to have confidence in abstract principles. And so, I don't know the answer on the political level. What I do know the answer is, and this is what Lewis talks about in that Hideous Strike. So he's got the Tower of Babel. We've got demonic principalities taking over the world through technological bureaucracy, and things are looking bad, and it feels like the end of the world. What are his protagonists doing in this story? They are dwelling together in godly community. They're making dinner. They're getting married. They're having children. They're growing vegetables. They're putting their own house in order, right? They're putting their own house in order. And I think that's, a really important message. We can get overwhelmed with trying to
For sure.
understand the collapse of modern culture and how to cope with it. And what I find really encouraging about Lewis's book is that he reminds us that, the rise and fall of nations is something God is in control of. And we can participate in the renewal of the world by binding ourselves and our families and our local communities to the great story, to the gospel story, through faithful Christian practice. And that actually, does far more than we realize.
Absolutely. The transformation of our inner world and the production of virtues in our life is the necessary precondition for any external world transformation. And so maybe the concern that we can, I'm maybe kind of trying to hold in tension here is this, you could go on the other extreme of being like, any efforts at AI are inherently demonic and we must reject them all. You could go in those extremes, or even I saw maybe it was another company or a sister company, somebody sharing that, hey, I think we may be able to identify the particular genetic sequences that we could use to eliminate cancer. I want cancer gone. Like, totally. I think in the age to come, there is no cancer. I think in the age to come, we are free of those mechanisms of disorder creation. I think that is the case. And so it may be really hard for people to figure out, well, how do I become the kind of person that not productively, closes the gap between Jesus's vision of the world and the Sermon on the Mount and the way the world is currently organized and situated. I recognize there's a gap. Everybody recognizes that there's a gap. John Lennon in his song Imagine recognized a gap, and I completely disagree with his vision in many regards, but he sees, and that's why people still sing that as a secular hymn. this gap between where the world currently is organized and this deep innate desire. It's not the way it should be. That's what we Christians have called the fall. But the space between here and the eschaton and closing that gap, I think that might be the thing. If I were to name specifically what we may be most wrestling with right now is discerning of spirits, the discerning of how does that gap get closed in a way that isn't techne, it's not sorcery, it's not dark magic, which actually doesn't bring about the right ordering of the cosmos. And I think maybe you've just nailed a fitting, appropriate conclusion to ruminate on, Annie, is the work ultimately that we should be most focused on. So yeah, maybe we should have some concern, especially if you work in AI spaces or, you've been called to the political spheres to sort through, whoa, should we fund this or not? I that's not my domain. But I think you've properly identified what C.S. Lewis calls us to is being people who have our inner worlds transformed by the life of Christ in such a way that we are virtuous enough to have that virtue spill out into the world. And there does seem to be some way in which that appears to be the way the world gets reconstituted into its proper ordering. Virtuous people in the way of Jesus, inner worlds transformed, not bleeding from our pain and our unhealed wounds and the sins that so easily ensnare us, not bleeding that out into the world, because that would be the difference between, we could have nuclear energy that would probably, do a lot of good to heal the planet, right? But we also figured out how to use that to destroy civilization in the same way. And what's the difference in application, if not a difference in virtue? The people who would be able to sift through that and employ that towards virtuous ends or to destructive, unharmful ends, that starts with an inner world transformation. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's excellent, Paul. And I think it will help us discern spirits and discern virtue by recovering teleology, a teleological understanding. Because remember, that was the difference between demonic masculine and sacred masculine, or sacred husbandry, to perceive the purposes and the meaning inherent in the things God has made, and honoring them and cultivating them. And so the ability to begin to read purpose in the world again, and that's why, for example, to understand the purpose of our own bodies as male and female, as a woman, not to just think, oh, this body is just mere matter and I'm just an individual human, but to say, no, my body has purposes, beautiful, good, God-given purposes written into the way that I'm formed, to again perceive the beauty and the goodness of those purpose and to look for creative ways to live out the flourishing of that purpose, right? That will do a lot to have men and women not at war with one another, but complementing one another so that we can, harmonious, find virtue as a people again, where men and women complement and help one another live out a holistic, healthy understanding of what it is to be human. So 100% with you, Paul. I think that was well said. And that just learning to attend to teleology, learning to read the meaning and the purpose of the world again will help us discern spirits and the application of virtue.
Wow, Annie, fantastic. This is such a gift. You are such a gift to the world, but to the spheres that you've been called to inhabit, and sharing from your deep well of, not only it's clear that this isn't just some academic intellectual pursuit for you, but this is a spiritual journey that you've been on as well. It's evident in how you speak about this, in the way you're synthesizing idea with spiritual formation, it's wonderful. I'm so glad we got to get connected, and I'm thankful that, I know we probably went a little over our time here, and you've been really generous with your time. So thank you, Annie.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. That's very kind. And it's wonderful to meet you and talk with you. Thank you so much.